Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Living Experiment podcast, the COVID edition, live with video. We're so advanced here. And I am really thrilled to have a guest with me today who is a friend and a colleague and a collaborator and a fellow healthy deviant and very much a fellow living experimenter. Steph Gaudreau, welcome to the Living Experiment.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. Well, you come with a long list of big credentials, not the least of which is that I've just known you personally for so long that I have great confidence in your ability to offer wisdom to health seekers, particularly thoughtful health seekers who are interested in pushing a little beyond the status quo, a little beyond the dogma of our health and fitness media. Steph is a certified intuitive eating counselor and a nutritional therapy practitioner, among other things. And a big part of her mission is helping women break up with their diets so that they can finally feel free to eat. And she has a great book, one of a few great books, but this is her most recent book called The Core Four. And in this book, she details a four-pillar approach to building health and embracing your body and owning your power, which is a big deal because we live in a health and fitness media environment that seems to be sucking our confidence and power right out of us. Steph also is trained in biology and human physiology. She's a nutritional therapy practitioner. She's a certified intuitive eating counselor and a USA weightlifting sports performance coach. You kind of cover all of the bases of health and fitness, don't you?
Yes, jack of all trades.
Yeah, and on top of that, she's a very accomplished podcaster. Her podcast, Listen to Your Body, has had 3 million plus downloads, and she speaks internationally and has been featured in all kinds of major media from Outside to Mind, Body, Green, and Self, and more. So, Steph, with all of that said, I have to say, I have known you as a friend, and Dallas Hartwig has known you for a friend for many years. I followed your work as I was working on Experience Life magazine back in the day, and I've always found you to be a voice of sanity and reason with a real interest in science and a real foot in the real world and helping people navigate what the truth is about any challenge you come up against with your health and fitness. You're having to navigate this very confusing media environment and 1,000 different opinions and strategies for doing it this way. Talk to me a little bit about where you've been in your journey over the past few years and what has brought you to your current focus in intuitive eating and associated content.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, to make the story as succinct as possible, I came from a traditional dieting background. And in about 2010, when I moved into eating a paleo type of framework with my nutrition, which was a complete accident, by the way, and just a fluke that I had found it, what I didn't realize at the time is that I took this sort of relationship that I had with food and a lot of the beliefs that I had about food and my body and showing up as a woman in the world. And I carried those beliefs with me like two really heavy suitcases into paleo. And while I learned a lot and it was an incredible stepping stone for me, after a while, I started to realize I was trying to justify if I wanted to eat outside the lines. You know, I think about coloring outside of the lines. So we have these guidelines and, you know, they might have really great intentions, but every time I wanted to eat outside the lines, I found myself having to try to justify it. Or every time I would make a recipe with a food that was sort of like not exactly along the paleo guidelines, I would have to justify it to the reader in the, you know, anybody who was reading the blog. And around the same time, I started to realize that for me, there were other foods that I wanted to eat that were okay with my body and my body didn't react poorly to, but that weren't on the sort of approved foods list that most people could agree with.
Give me an example, just so I understand.
Okay, potatoes. Potatoes or peas, you know, fresh green peas. Or I remember reading a Mark's Daily Apple blog post many, many years ago. We're talking maybe a decade ago at this point, but about why legumes weren't okay, but because peas or green beans were mostly green fleshy pod, that was okay. And it was so confusing, right?
Totally confusing, yes.
Around the same time, I started to also notice that within the community, whether that's my readers or people listening to the podcast, there was an increase, an uptick in the amount of stories I was hearing from people that were saying things like, I started doing this because I wanted things to be simple. And now I'm more confused than ever. Or I've tried this way of eating and then that way of eating and then another way of eating. And I'm all for experimentation. And I know you are too, right? This is the living experiment. But at the same time, the amount of sort of mental strain and anxiety and really actually disordered behaviors around food that I was noticing was increasing so much. And I think honestly, if I was, let's say I was a vegan blogger, I think I probably would have noticed very similar things, but just in a different way. And it all sort of falls under this idea of, when we get really dogmatic with food, what is the result? And that really led me on this journey to try to figure out how could I learn to improve my relationship with food and set down those heavy bags that I'd been carrying for so long and eat in a way that still made me feel good in my body, that made me feel healthy, that helped me understand that when I was doing Weight Watchers many, many years ago, why did I behave certain ways around food? Or when I set out to say, okay, I can't eat any sugar ever again, why did the first thing I want to eat was sugar when normally I wouldn't think about it? So I really sort of landed on intuitive eating and helping people and really helping myself improve that relationship with food, find a way of eating, yes, healthily, that gets you to your goals, that makes you feel strong, gives you energy, but is not so rigid. And so that's where I am right now. And I really do have the sort of two sides of that coin, right? The nutritional therapy, nutrition science world, the food psychology, and then also the sort of intuitive eating space, looking for that more gray area and less rigidity.
That's fantastic. I have to say, I found myself in that same place through a lot of trial and error over the course of a couple decades. And, it's a story I tell in my book, The Healthy Deviant, about this kind of downward spiral that I went on until I hit this rock bottom place of having tried and failed at so many different kinds of diets. And by failed, what I mean is I couldn't comfortably sustain that way of eating and also feel good in my own skin, in my body and mind. Becoming obsessive about food is something that I think just follows on dieting. Like if you go on diets or even try a diet, within a matter of minutes for me, if I put myself on any kind of diet or protocol for whatever reason, I'm immediately obsessed with food. Whereas when I'm just eating how I want to eat. Now, to be fair, I've been practicing different trial and error strategies and experiments for many years. I'm amazed at the level of freedom I feel and how resilient my body is in responding to kind of a fairly varied diet with quite a lot of consistency. And I think that's a sign of metabolic health. And I think it's a sign of mind-body health that comes over time from respecting your body's real needs and cravings and not marrying yourself to this either endless series of yo-yo kinds of diets or marrying yourself so completely to one way of eating that is so rigidly described that it feels like a religion. And I can't tell you, how many people I've talked to over the years who have, really related to the idea of orthorexia, which I think when it first came out, a lot of us were like, really? Now it's a disease to be a healthy eater. But the more I looked at that, the more I observed that people really were stuck in a very unhealthy frame of mind and a sort of disordered set of eating patterns based on trying really, really hard to do all of the right things and not being sure of what those right things are. So talk to me a little bit about, just for people who are not familiar with the idea of what intuitive eating is as a construct or as a methodology, how do you go about describing it to people?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's such a broad and deep framework. It's really a set of principles, not strict rules, but a set of principles that are there to help you reclaim your relationship with food and reclaim your inner intuitive eater. We are all born as intuitive eaters. Anybody here who's ever parented a child or been a caretaker for a child knows that child is very in touch with their hunger and fullness signals, right? The child knows when they're hungry and when they're full typically. And intuitive eating is more than just a hunger and fullness diet, but or a hunger and fullness way of approaching food, but we all started out life that way. And so it's I love to remind people of that, because this is, maybe you've been out of touch with it for a long time, but this is our natural state as eaters, is to eat a little bit intuitively. Or maybe you've had a toddler around you for a while, or a small child, and you think, on one day, this kid just wants to eat grapes. And then, like maybe the next day they're going to have some chicken and, I don't know, some crackers or whatever else it is. And then sort of over a few days, those sort of seemingly strange eating patterns kind of level out. And so again, that's kind of this example of, yes, we are all born as intuitive eaters, but it's really a set of guidelines and a framework that's there to help you reclaim your contact with that inner intuitive eater, to build contact again with your body signals, to get more in touch with what is satisfying to you in terms of food, to be more mindful of your connection when you're eating to that food, to explore movement in a way that is really yummy and joyful instead of just punitive, right? Normally we kind of view exercise as being very punishing, or making up for what we ate, or earning our food. And it kind of puts all of those things together, along with things like emotional resilience, finding other ways to meet and honor our emotions, only, in addition to only eating food, because emotional eating is very normal. But if it's our only coping strategy, then what other strategies can we build in place there? So it's really a very personal practice. It is a practice. One of the things that I hear so often from folks who come out of more restrictive eating plans, they'll say, but it wasn't a diet. And it's okay. I don't have a dieting mentality. But then they'll ask me, I think I'm doing this wrong. Like, I think I'm messing it up. Did I fail at intuitive eating? And it's really a process, right? It's really a process that challenges you to find what works for you. Yes, honor the very legitimate food intolerances you might have, or food allergies, or food preferences. Some people, I know our good friend Dallas Hartwig hates tomatoes, right? So intuitive eating would never say, Dallas Hartwig, you need to eat tomatoes.
Right.
um,
Right.
but also is really allowing people to explore, to add foods back in that bring them joy. What are the culturally significant or ethnically significant foods even that you've been told by dieting are not okay? And of course, that tends to take a very like white Eurocentric approach in terms of what's healthy, and I'm using air quotes, and not healthy. So are there foods that you want to reconnect with? And it's really a very joyful, very expansive way of approaching food. But there are a lot of stumbling blocks that people can kind of hit along the way, because it is very open and fluid. So there's a few things I try to help people focus on, because you can get pretty easily lost in the weeds if you're worried about doing it right.
Tell me about those. Tell me about
Yes.
those frameworks. Yes.
For sure. So again, there's 10 principles, but the things that I pull out most often as coming back to over and over, and these can help you, I think, no matter where you're at in finding this version of food freedom that's very personal to you. The first one is mindfulness. And of course, mindfulness and mindful awareness comes out of Eastern religious and philosophical tradition, but really as applied to food and eating, we know as mindful eating. And I always like to remind people, okay, if you're working with me or you're interested in intuitive eating, you've read the book, maybe you want to start practicing it, you can't make change unless you're aware of what you're doing, of what you want to even change. And for me, it comes down to awareness, willingness, and then aligned action. And I think when those three things are together, then we can make change. But mindfulness can be very simple. And normally when people think about changing their relationship with food, they're like, oh, it's going to be this big list of yes foods and no foods, and I have to adapt everything I'm doing and cooking, and it gets really overwhelming. And so I love mindfulness, or the practice of mindful eating, because it's just about being more present and more aware, and even in really small chunks. So you might say, gratitude is a part of a mindful or mindfulness or mindful eating practice. How can you just get the sense of gratitude for what you're eating, or who prepared the food, or the fact that you have a regular source of food in your life, which is a lot of people don't have. It could be something like just noticing how full you are as you're eating. It could be putting your fork down and chewing a little bit more slowly. Maybe for the first couple of minutes of your meal, you just sit there without any other distraction. And some of my clients say, okay, the whole meal is a lot of time, but maybe so I say, okay, like, can we bargain? Can you do the first 5 minutes? And they're like, okay, I can start with that. So just noticing, what do you like about the food? What are you enjoying? Are you liking the textures, the flavors, the temperature, the way it looks on the plate, and really just connecting? So I think
Yeah.
that's the first thing. The second thing is satisfaction. And I know you are talking a lot more about things like pleasure and what we allow ourselves to find as pleasurable or to give ourselves that kind of pleasure. And pleasure with eating is something that a lot of people fear.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of fear around, well, if I allow myself to enjoy this, then I'm never going to stop eating.
Yeah.
And that is a very loaded thing, but I like to ask people to reflect on, in a given meal, is there anything that you're enjoying here that's satisfying to you? And it doesn't have to be a 5-star, multi-course experience. That's very fancy. But on every plate, I'm always thinking about what's one little thing I can add that's going to make me feel satisfied. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a difference between satisfaction and fullness. So I gave this example on my Facebook earlier today that you could eat bags of kale or bunches of broccoli and your stomach might get full. You might chug a bunch of water. You have all sorts of tricks that you use to make your stomach feel like it's reached its capacity. But in a lot of those cases, you will not be satisfied. It's
No.
just missing that thing, right? And
Like
so,
eating a bag of low-fat potato chips. At some point, you're like, "This is
yeah.
not working for me," and you can eat 400 of them, and you're
Yes.
still not gonna be satisfied, which, of course, is part of what has led people down a fairly dangerous path, I think, all the we often reference, like, the snack wells,
Yes.
phenomenon of those fat-free, sugar-free, disgusting, cardboard, puffy, nasty things. But most diet sodas, most things that are baked that you think should probably be fried, like, there's just
Mhm.
this endless series of foods that have been presented as though they're gonna bring you pleasure and a sense of indulgent goodness, which is why we go after the original things, and then they absolutely never do. You can't possibly get enough of them. So, yeah, I totally
Yeah.
relate to that.
Absolutely. So looking for little things that are satisfying on your plate. Again, the fear is that, oh my gosh, I'm only going to want to eat, I call them fun foods. Like, I'm only going to want to eat fun foods if I'm looking for things that are satisfying. But oftentimes that's the fear part of your brain talking, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of like the, oh my gosh, I can't control myself. But really thinking about, is a little bit of avocado on that. It's usually things with fat in them because fat
Mhm.
is delicious. It makes things satisfying. It has energy, right? It gives you that nice mouth feel, and or a sprinkle of sunflower seeds, or maybe a vegetable that you really like. Like, what's going to bring you a little bit of satisfaction on that plate? And I will give you like a 99% guarantee that if you start doing that, you will probably stop seeking food soon after you eat. So a lot of people will say, I just ate. Why am I looking for more food? I don't get it. Like, or even my stomach is full, but why do I keep seeking something? And it's normally because that little note of whatever would be satisfying was missing. And
Yeah.
sometimes that can actually lead people to get overly full, or to, eat past their comfortable fullness because they're just still seeking that
Something.
thing.
The grazing. Yeah,
Yes.
I remember when I was in my early 30s and I kind of had stumbled across a salad that actually worked for me. And I remember one day eating the salad and being like, usually I eat salads and I'm left feeling a little bit like hard done by, or like my meal kind of went by me and I didn't really get much out of it. This particular salad had like all of the goodies in it. It had protein. I don't know what it was, grilled chicken or something, but it had a little bit of like dried cherries that brought sweetness and chew. It had olive oil, it had lemon, it had avocado. And it was like this kind of weird amalgamation of stuff I had in my house that I had put together intuitively, but then ended up being profoundly satisfying. And I like compared that salad to a bunch of salads I'd eaten before, which were a little bit more, I don't know, stoic, I guess. And I realized I often was just left being, I was, like you said, full, but not really satisfied. The textures, the flavors, the aromas hadn't been fulfilling to me in any way. And I do think it's interesting. My partner is a chef, and
Hmm.
we were talking just the other day. And I know your background is, you've written, how many cookbooks did you do? 3? I can't remember. You had like, before you got
I
into
have
this.
two cookbooks. Well, I have one like straight cookbook, and then the other one has the core four has some recipes in it too,
Okay.
and like
Okay.
400 recipes on the website.
Yeah, and on your website, you had like this amazing, all these blog recipes, everything. So you're infused into the same world that he is of, really being interested in what makes a dish pop. And we were talking about how, in perfume, as in food, there's sort of a base note and a mid note and a top note, and they all kind of balance each other. And I'm forever squeezing lemon on everything and using Malden sea salt and cracked pepper. I'm always adding oils of some kind or another. And again, I've learned to do that as an intuitive eater, not as a culinary expert of any kind. But it's interesting when we compare notes about what a dish wants or needs or what would go well with something else. It often those things go together. Like what brings in the base note of protein and fat, and what brings in this mid note of textures and things like, nuts and seeds, and what brings in the top note of typically an acid or a bright shot of something. It really does kind of make for the same thing is true of texture, right? There's like the big, like kind of satisfying kind of meat or potatoesy kind of feel of the base, and then all the textures in the middle, and then the fanciful garnishes and herbs and things on the top. It's same thing happens in color. But people tend to separate these worlds of culinary versus health eating, and or eating for pleasure and satisfaction on the sensory level versus eating for nutritionism, and like getting your macros and your micros in and worrying about every little gram or speck that you're eating. And I think that level of mental anxiety that builds from doing it like a math problem puts stress in your system and
Mm-hmm.
leads you into doubt and this feeling of trying and failing, or you're not doing it right, everything you just described. I feel such an enormous sense of relief since I left that part of my eating life behind. And I sometimes struggle to explain to people who sometimes ask, how do you eat? I'm sure you get this a lot, right? Like, what, but you're eating that? I get that a lot too. When you're out to eat with
Mm-hmm.
somebody and you order French fries and they're like, oh, like they would never eat that in public. I'm like, anything I eat in private, I will eat in public, and vice versa. Like, it's like, there is no back door. Um, but I can see that, when I start to describe this way of eating, people, sometimes their eyes kind of glaze over, or they just think, oh, that works for you because,
Mm-hmm.
you're naturally whatever you are. You're naturally don't have a weight problem. You never had a problem. And I'm like, that is actually not true. When I had the biggest problem with my weight was when I was dieting, so-called problem. I don't know if it was a problem at all. What it was it made me really uncomfortable, and I obsessed about it constantly. And I don't anymore. And I feel like, yeah, it is a level of freedom that I think very few people experience. And I will include increasingly, I was going to say women experience, but I think increasingly anybody who's health concerned or appearance concerned is finding themselves wrapped up in the same sort of conundrum of the right way versus the wrong way, and, paleo versus vegan, high carb versus low carb, keto versus carnivore. Like it's just an
Mm-hmm.
endless series of match, like death match eating arguments. So
Yeah.
getting out of that, I can see would be profoundly attractive. What are you finding in terms of the people for whom this works well? Even right out of the gate, people who find themselves just like, relaxing into the warm and comforting embrace of intuitive eating,
Mm-hmm.
versus the people who get in and either struggle or just like don't trust themselves enough to let it play out. Talk to me a little bit about who you think it's for, and whom, if anyone, it might not be for.
Sure. So, the last part that I was going to mention, I think this dovetails really nicely, is
Mm.
this concept of gentle nutrition. So people think, okay, well, intuitive eating doesn't care about what your health is. It's all about, just binge on any junk food that you want. And that could be further from the truth. The 10th principle is actually honor your health with gentle nutrition.
Mm.
And so I just wanted to introduce a couple of concepts that I think will resonate. So
Yeah.
yes, health is definitely a focus. And it's just normally kind of put at the end because most of the people I work with are already really savvy. They've read all the blogs, they listen to all the podcasts, they have a biohacker level knowledge of things like some things that are so obscure, like the right antioxidants and, the supplements. And there's, again, so much information. How do you make it not overwhelming? And how do you make health not just a checklist of things that you're supposed to do every day that then stresses you out, or if you're doing it the right or wrong way? So I always like to remind people to focus on the big rocks. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this analogy, but sort of there is, if you have a container and you want to fill up all the space, right? And let's say you have big rocks, you have gravel, and then you have sand. Yes, the sand is going to fill up the nooks and crannies in between, but if the rocks aren't there, then it's just going to be kind of like an imbalanced situation where the thing is just packed full of sand. So if you put a bunch of big rocks in your container, right, they're going to take up a bunch of space, and then you fill in the gaps with your there's
Hello.
my cat. You fill in the gaps with the pebbles or the small rocks, and then the sand fills in the rest of the gaps. So I think most people right now in the world are focusing on the sand, especially in the nutrition space. They're focusing on the tiny, tiny, tiny little details, and they're making themselves really stressed out over and in sort of in this analysis paralysis over getting all the tiny details right. So what I would ask people to think about is, what are 2 or 3 of those big rocks that you want to add to your routine every day, or you want to do on a consistent basis? And I'm learning, this is a side tangent, but I'm learning Portuguese right now through a language app. And the way the language app reminds you is it says, try to do every day, but if you miss a day, that's okay. Just try not to miss 2 days in a row. And I love that, because my sort of perfectionist leaning brain goes, oh, okay, I didn't mess it all up. And I think we tend to see the same thing in nutrition, where if people think if they're not perfect every day at cutting out the sugar and cutting out the grains, or cutting out the whatever the foods that the bread or whatever it is, the foods that they think they shouldn't be eating.
Yeah.
They think they've done it wrong. And now we add in even things like the effects of dietary restraint on people's health or their stress levels, their digestive function is really impactful. And I don't think we think about it a lot. So what are 2 or 3 things that you want to focus on adding into your day as sort of those big rocks? For me, it's protein at as many meals as I can make happen, because I know that makes me feel satiated. For me, I try to eat a vegetable at every meal. I mean, these aren't like earth-shattering things. And also including something satisfying on my plate. I would say those are my 3 things that I try to focus on most. If I miss a meal, I don't stress about it. I try not to miss 2 or 3 meals in a row. If I do, that's okay. I know it's not perfect, but I'm trying to get back to those big rocks all the time. So I would say for people that are really hyper nutrition centered, and again, if you have to do it for health reasons, or you're on a medical nutrition plan to manage a disease or a health condition that you have, that's great. Like, there's definitely room for even things like thinking about your beliefs about food. So the things that I told you about today with intuitive eating are very practical, but there's also a very sort of like mental emotional side of it, which is understanding what are your beliefs about food? Where did those beliefs come from? How are those beliefs influenced by things like diet culture or our current world, where we're very aesthetics and thinness focused? So I gave you the sort of practical nuts and bolts, but if you are a nutrition focused person, great. I want you to go into a grocery store or prepare your meal and think about, what are some things I can add to this plate that will bring me satisfaction, that will bring me fullness, that will bring me energy, instead of only ever focusing on the cutting away. So you asked me who tends to have maybe a tougher time with this. People that, for whatever reason, have never allowed themselves the autonomy to make food decisions for themselves, because they've either been on a really prescriptive calorie plan, or these are the foods that you can only eat. People of that experience can struggle at the beginning, because they're not used to even making their own choices. And so we talked about health, right? Authentic health in an intuitive eating framework is saying, are there external values in the world that could shape or influence how I eat? For example, I might be practicing a religion that has certain food guidelines, right?
Mhm.
Maybe there is religious fasting. Maybe there are certain foods that aren't eaten, or if they're not eaten in combination together.
Mhm.
Do I have values of sustainability, right?
Mhm.
Do I have values of managing a health condition, and I know that I can't eat a certain food? So there are external values, and some of them are totally valid.
Mhm.
But what's really missing, and the people who tend to have a hard time at the beginning, are those who have no sense of an internal locus of control, or an internal locus of, my body is smart. In fact, been trying to outsmart my body with dieting for years and years and years, and heavy restricting and fad diets. And why do I keep ending up back at this place? Because our bodies are smart, right? We cut down on food, or you talked about earlier how if you say you can't eat a certain food, then you want to eat it right away. Well, that's because of how it affects our physiology, our biology, and our psychology. So it's
Yes.
really both.
Yeah.
So really learning to balance out the external information that we've held up on a pedestal, and start to infuse ourselves into that equation, and looking for the overlap.
Mhm.
And that is really where authentic health lies, is in the overlap between what our bodies are telling us and what we know from our external values, nutrition science. Nobody is saying that a Snickers bar and an apple are the same, right? Like, we know that stuff, it has a difference, but we're really looking for that overlap, and everybody's idea of health is going to be different. And it is, as you said earlier, yes, it's our physical health, but our mental, emotional health, our spiritual well-being, our social connections, which we know are really suffering in this time of COVID. Like, there's so much that goes into food. It's not just fuel. So I think that if you are a very rigid thinker,
Yeah.
learning to flex your thinking is a huge part of intuitive eating. Also, if you're somebody who is in eating disorder recovery, you generally are going to want to work with somebody on your recovery or treatment team,
Yeah.
because very easily people can think, well, intuitive eating is a hunger and fullness diet. I'm not hungry right now, so I just shouldn't eat. And we also have to use our logic. We get to
Yes.
use our rational thinking brains, right? For all of my science and analytical lovers, we get to use that part of our brain to say, you know what, I can meal plan. That's fine, right? I know that even if I'm not feeling particularly hungry in this moment, if I have trouble connecting to my hunger signals, maybe I'm on a medication that dampens my ability to sense my own hunger. Maybe I'm very anxious or stressed, which we know can also
Yeah.
reduce our food seeking, because our digestive function is decreased in those times. I'm going to logically use my thinking mind and say, okay, still need to give myself some energy now. So that would be sort of, maybe who it's not for, but slash, who might need extra guidance and support rather than just reading the book,
Yeah.
or implementing from listening to a podcast or something like that. Sometimes there's other circumstances for people that just need extra support to understand how to put those things into practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that all of us live in a culture where we've been programmed to believe certain things about food and to want certain kinds of food or to consider desirable certain kinds of food that have been engineered to play on our most basic biologies and needs, like from an evolutionary biology standpoint, we know like fat and sugar and salt are survival mechanisms. They're very desirable in an evolutionary biology setting, in a hunter-gatherer world. Those things are rare. And in our world, they've been engineered to be ever present in everything and to be, quite literally addictive. You can't eat just one. But we also live in a world that has then caused us to feel and believe certain things about good and bad foods and all of the ratios that we've been programmed to believe we have to have. I mean, from the 4 food groups when I was a child that were taught in textbooks, it was crazy, still crazy what's going on with myplate.gov. The USDA nutrition guidelines, there's battles endlessly about the quality of science or lack thereof that makes their way into those. So it's no wonder that people are confused. It's no wonder that people believe that if they only had the right information, the right guidance, the right specific program, that just tell me what to eat line that you hear over and over again. Well, just tell me what to eat. But then the people, you could tell people what to eat, I guess. But yeah, how fun would that be? And also, who can do that? The minute I tell you exactly what to eat, I guarantee you're going to want to eat something else. And when you either eat it and then feel terrible about yourself, or don't eat it and then are hating your life because you can't have that thing, you're losing at this game again. And I think that's one of my passions, is like, I want to see people start winning at this game called life, and enjoying their food and enjoying their movement and enjoying their rest and recovery and finding pleasure in all of it. But the way that we've been educated or miseducated to think about food and to relate to it, I do think it requires a pretty significant re-education. And that's something each of us has to take on ourselves, often, I think, through a rather circuitous and unfortunately very troubling path. I think, has all of the eating disorders that have emerged, including orthorexia, from this miseducation that has happened through our media, is something that's going to take a real army of people, to help adjust for and resolve. And I think you said something earlier about, willingness to experiment and to try something a little different and get the support that you need to try it. All of that makes a ton of sense. Another thing I wanted to just respond to is this question about the science. There's a nutritionism, as Michael Pollan calls it, this kind of obsession with the science of, every carb, gram, calorie burn, calorie out, calorie in, calorie out. What kinds of fats? Is it a polyunsaturated fat or a saturated fat? Is a medium chain triglyceride, or is it an essential fatty acid? Is it an omega-3 or an omega-6? Who can keep all of that straight and still have any level of sanity? So there's science that's useful, and then there's science that's just incredibly confusing. But here's one piece of science that I think you alluded to earlier that I'd like to underline, which is how our psychology, how our mental processing relates to our seeking and choosing and eating of food and our processing of it. Because you use the term restraint. And I was amazed when I was doing research for my book about the science of what happens to restrained eaters when they are going about trying to make their restrained eating decisions. Some interesting science about how it actually, people become cognitively impaired as the result of obsessing about only eating these certain things, about tightly controlling, for example, their calorie or carb intake, or having a very rigid hierarchy of, things that are in or out. And that the more you obsess over that stuff, the more mental energy is demanded from you, the more willpower is demanded from you, and the more you become drained and dysregulated, to the point that they found people were actually less capable of interpreting packaging claims, for example, and reading the nutrition stuff on the back. They were just kind of like at a loss after all of that effort and determination to be good and to follow the rules. They actually diminish their capacity to make sensible decisions, much less take any pleasure in what they were eating. And I think that that's the kind of crazy making cycle that we find ourselves on. And then it does sometimes take a period of months or even years to like re-regulate ourselves. I was telling Dallas, when I came back, I did a water fast for the first time in my life with a friend a few years ago. And I did this for a medical reason, and it was a medically supervised fast. But I had never done a significant fast like that before. Like I said, I went into it having no health issues, no weight issues, and really not being terribly concerned about my nutrition at any level. By the time I got out of that water fast, I remember specifically, Steph, because I read one of your blogs about like a pork shoulder roast recipe or something. And I was sitting in this little room at the medical fast center Googling, like, where can I get a crock pot and a chest freezer and an entire pig, which I then promptly ordered. A Mangalitsa pig, which by the way is like 95% fat. If you've never seen a Mangalitsa pig, they're crazy. It's a small but very fat pig, which I got the entire pig cut up and put into a freezer. And then I basically proceeded to make Alan prepare a variety of roast pork dishes for me, which I then ate constantly. But that's the closest to food obsessed I have ever been, and even back to like my teenage years, because restricting my food made me obsess about it to the point that
Mhm.
I was really quite out of my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I've been not restricting my food. The last time I restricted food was about 2016 when I was cutting weight for a weightlifting meet and I was counting macros. So I was essentially, calorie counting, which is basically what macros are. It's just split up into, three different categories,
Yep.
protein, carbs, and fat. And so I hadn't restricted food in for 4 or 5 years, and I had some dental work done. And for the dental work, I had to cut off my eating at a certain time of the night. Now, today, the last time I ate something was it's a little after 2 o'clock. So the last time I ate was about 9:30 this morning. I haven't thought about food since then.
Yeah.
So I can go for many hours without, it really preoccupying my thinking. And yet, when I had this dental work done and I was supposed to not eat, the only thing I could think about was eating.
Yeah.
And how much longer, and what am I going to make, and it was the most mild example, right? This temporary
Yeah.
food restriction, but psychologically, as soon as my brain perceived that there was not food available, and there are studies that back this up as well, that all of a sudden my food preoccupation increased.
Of
For
course.
some people, seeking of food increases, hoarding of food increases,
Absolutely.
binging of food increases. And one of actually the most vulnerable populations for binge eating is folks who have food insecurity,
Yeah.
right? So think about if food is not available, for whatever reason. And those are some of the most vulnerable folks to have binge eating afterwards, is like when they finally have food around. Another example is when I was a kid, or a teenager, we had a cat, and we rescued this cat from a dumpster. And he was the most loving, wonderful, amazing cat. It's probably my favorite cat I've ever had. Don't tell my cat now, but he was the best cat. But because he had such food insecurity as a kitten,
Mm-hmm.
even though they had plentiful food when we adopted him, his food seeking drive and food seeking behavior was out of control.
Yeah.
He just, and how do you give a cat therapy? I don't know, but it just sort of, it highlighted the result of what happens, not just biologically, but psychologically. The
Yes.
other thing that tends to happen with a lot of the folks that I work with is they'll say, okay, I've done these 30-day restrictive plans, or even a legitimate sort of food elimination plan. And they'll say, okay, I'm going to stop the cycle. I'm going to stop the cycle of restriction. And one of the first things that happens is it's like the different ways it's described is, the gloves came off, the floodgates were opened. I felt like I couldn't control myself, and it kind of swings the other way, and people feel really bad in their bodies and yucky, and
Yeah.
they're, bloated, or they're just overdoing it, and they don't feel good about themselves either. And so they're like, that's not great either. How do I find this middle space? And I tell them, hey, you know what happens when you let go of the restraint is this concept of backlash eating.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not you. This is how your brain works. It's how your body is now kind of trying to make up for lost time because of all of the physical restriction. And so, yes, we're attempting to move you into that like calmer, more peaceful middle state. You're not always going to be at that heightened state of seeking food and wanting to overdo it. And that often happens when people do it on their own. So this is again why I think guidance is really helpful, because you can, or having a community that you're doing this in, so that you can say, this is happening to me. Am I the only one? And people are saying no. Like,
No.
here's what can happen. But it's very powerful. The opposite happens also, where sometimes people will say, okay, I'm going to start the plan, start the diet on Monday or whatever it is. And there is an uptick in food seeking behavior.
Yeah.
And we call that last supper eating.
Yeah.
Where
I
it's like,
better my last chance
yes,
Texaco here.
it's my
Yeah.
last chance, right? I'm going to get it all in while I can. And again, two very common phenomena on both sides of the
Yeah.
restriction. But there is then the more damaging part that I see with people, and the part that really eats away at people's self-worth and self-confidence, is then the guilt and
Mhm.
the resulting shame
Mhm.
that follows that. So your body might feel weird or gross or yucky for maybe you're bloated or sluggish, or your digestion's all out of whack, or your blood sugar's nuts and you're tired or you're cranky or whatever it is. And that usually passes. But what lingers, Pilar, is the feeling of guilt, like I did something bad, but then the internalization that then becomes shame, which is I am bad. I am
Yeah.
bad for doing this. I am bad because I'm always a failure at this, and
Yeah.
what is wrong with me. And that is the part that is, sometimes I work with people who also have a therapist because of whatever reason, and there's sometimes really deep stuff that is tangled up in food, right? Our self-worth, our sense of even who we are,
Yeah.
our sense of having value in the world, our sense of being seen, our sense of being safe in the world is oftentimes really connected to food. So it can go pretty deep.
Yeah.
And that psychological impact of the restriction, and I think people get a little bit mixed up in thinking, well, does that mean I don't have discipline, or I don't have the sort of big rocks that I know make me feel good? And that's certainly not the case. Obviously, having some sense of like the foods that make you feel the best and the foods that make you feel great in your body is
Yeah.
wonderful. That's really what we're striving for with intuitive eating. But then what happens if you can't maintain the rigidity? How do you show yourself compassion? How do you prevent that all or nothing sort of cognitive distortion from
Yeah.
playing out in your life? And so that's what we oftentimes get into with the more detailed, more nuanced stuff, because it is very nuanced.
It is. Well, I want to just reflect on, this. We live in a culture which, like I said, on the one hand, programs us to want all of the things, both all of the things in terms of like, it's got to be good, good for you. Like, it has to be organic and it has to be, we have the list of all the kind of, um, attributes that we want our food to have. Then there's the list of things that we think make it desirable, like it's indulgent or it's, maybe bad for you. And like, it's like the thing that you're not supposed to eat. And that's really attractive. And then there's all the stuff that we start to internalize from the health and fitness media about, the macros, the micros, gluten-free or dairy-free, or, there's a long list of, if you're vegan or paleo and you're in that belief system. So you have these overlapping experiences of outside information coming at you. And then you have the internal response of your body. For me, I ate gluten with impunity until I went to France and lived in an environment where I was really food insecure. I didn't have any money. And what can you eat for really cheap in France? Bread. I ate a ton of bread and I drank a ton of coffee. And I had so much adrenal overload from stress and anxiety about all the different aspects of my life at that time, triggered this single nucleotide polymorphism that I was carrying in my body as a basically a celiac gene that my father had carried, and it turned on. And
Hmm.
suddenly, despite the fact that in my head I did not believe myself to be a gluten intolerant person, my body was telling me very clearly. And took me like a year to figure out, and a couple of health practitioners, a chiropractor, interestingly. Um, but the minute I went off of gluten, oh my God, I felt so much better. And every single time I would try to like go back on it, I felt terrible. My skin would break out, my digestion would be terrible. So, in level of intuitive eating, like it is not for me an academic thing. Like, oh, I think it is better that we don't eat gluten. Like, my body does not like gluten. I'm not going to eat gluten. But there are other things, like I've learned over the years, like I can handle a little sugar, not a ton, but a little. And fat of all kinds, I seem to be able to do really well with. And I got myself lucky because my body seems to like it. When I got genetically tested, there was great affirmation of all of that. Like based on my genotype, the things I have figured out I can do, like get away with, the things I can indulge in happily and take pleasure in without any remorse are pretty much proven out by the science. But I don't really care anymore so much about the science part of it. It was an affirmation because I have been learning to trust my body and what it says. The other example, I told you I went on this crazy water fast a few years ago. The reason I went on the water fast was that I was getting holes in my tongue. And I was developing what's known as geographic tongue, but like way worse than that, like a pitted crater-like set of holes in my tongue. It was awful to look at. And I tried a bunch of stuff of going on or off this or that thing, and nothing seemed to work. But finally, when I did this water fast, lo and behold, 3 days later, healed up. And it took me figuring out what it was, because it wasn't anything I knew I was responsible to, but it was some raw nuts, like raw pecans and raw walnuts, which I had been putting into my very healthy daily smoothie for years, along with a lot of raw greens like spinach or kale and things that had their own. So I've now discovered I have to pace myself with some of these things, or I will start to develop it again. But it amazes me to this day that I had to go to that extreme to figure it out, because I had to pull everything out and then pull things back in. But also what happened to me as the result of that intervention was that I, at least temporarily, became extremely food obsessed. And that was a lesson to me too, that it's a fine line to walk, figuring out your so-called optimal eating pattern or way of eating or diet, if you want to call it that. And this is true too of people I think of on autoimmune protocols and things, where they suddenly have to become extremely restricted to try to get down the triggers that are causing body-wide inflammation and potentially, really threatening their lives, or at least their ability to enjoy their lives. And so I think it's not an either or thing. I think there are times to experiment with restriction in the service of your goals, in the service of your body's own, its integrity. And it's really important to understand that every time you do that, there's going to be an action-reaction response. The other thing I want to share is I've got a friend who is an expert on eating and mindful eating and recovery from eating disorders. And she acknowledges to this day that it's a dangerous path for her to go on. She was doing intermittent fasting because it seemed like, a great thing to do. And a bunch of functional medicine doctors were like, intermittent fasting, it'll be great. And she got so obsessed about her intermittent fasting. Her feeding window was like this. She's rail thin to begin with, then got a health condition that's very serious, and she had no wiggle room, did not have any weight that she could afford to lose. And we were talking about that. It's like, how is this serving you now? And it's like pausing to think about that from, I think, each meal. Like, how does this meal serve you? How might a meal serve you now? If you're hungry or not hungry, if you're hungry for something, but every time you eat it, you're miserable with gastric distress, is there something else that might be as delicious and wonderful, but not make you sick? Or do you need to be made sick to remember why you don't eat that thing? All of those things are, I think, fair bet. Are fair game. Another little comment. It's nice to see people commenting here. The best studies are self-studies, and sometimes that means ignoring the scientific studies out there, because there's just not one size fits all approach. We have to take everything with a grain of salt, says Leah. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of throw a little thing in there too, I think, so as somebody who's trained in science and taught science and understands how to read papers and the difference between reviews and primary research, I think that the tricky part is that science is not unbiased, because science is done by human beings, and we're all biased. We all have internalized biases. And who is the science being done on?
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that most of the research that we have out there is not done on diverse enough populations. The researchers themselves oftentimes do not come from diverse populations, or even people in larger bodies. I mean, it's studies that are not really done on women of pre-menopausal age, because of the complication, and I'm using air quotes, right? The complication of having fluctuating hormonal levels throughout the cycle. So there's just a lot that there are flaws in science. And so I don't think we should throw it all away, but I think we have to kind of keep that in the back of our minds as well, is where is, yes, and I love that comment about sort of the n=1. Where is their room for that? And if your body is telling you very clearly, hey, this food is not okay, it's okay to avoid that food. I'm glad that you brought up things like autoimmune protocol, because I do also work with a lot of people who are on AIP, or they've done it, and it's been very helpful for them in a lot of ways. But the sort of figuring out how to live your own personal version of that, or whatever the elimination plan is, and a lot of times extremely valid for reasons for doing those things, I think what I would like to see is for folks who are coaching these things or even practitioners is that they also become up to date on food psychology and they
Yes.
know how to counsel their patients or their clients on how to navigate that ground, because there could be, I see so much anxiety
Mm.
and fear and worry in folks who have to restrict for legitimate reasons. And I always say, like, hey, when you have to restrict for legitimate reasons, that's its own challenge. But no one gets a prize for having the most voluntarily restrictive diet, right? But
Yeah.
that's sort of where we're at right now with like plans that have become the level of fad.
Mm.
And so that's just some of the stuff I would love to see more folks who are either getting intuitive eating certified as well, or they're just more up to date on like the psychology and how to counsel
Yeah.
their clients and their patients on things like reintroduction, or yes, food is a slice of the health pie, but it is not everything. You know, how can stress be exacerbating your autoimmune flare, or how could whatever else is going on, how could environmental things be affecting your health? And I think we get so tunnel vision in this space and we think food is the only thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's certainly impactful, but it's not the only facet of wellness. I feel like it is the one that we focus on the most because we all have to eat, right?
Yeah.
We're having to face that every single day of our lives, but we get, I think, a little bit too focused on it at the expense of other things sometimes when it comes to our health and well-being.
I agree.
Yeah.
I want to follow up on something you were saying about the science too, Steph, which I think is so important, is that, there are all kinds of biases in the way that science is done and what is considered to be a good outcome. And I'm thinking about some of the stuff that David Ludwig, Dr. David Ludwig from Harvard, who's written books like Always Hungry, talks about that the science that, they do to show one diet is better than the other. Typically in the world of weight loss, this is like who loses the most weight in a certain span on a certain plan. And that's if it's like a feeding study. Most of the
Mhm.
time it's all self-reported too. So it's like we don't really know whether the data is any good or not. Like, do you remember even what you ate for breakfast? Would you be honest about it if you were part of one of these studies? Like, I don't know. But David makes this really good point, which is that one of the things that they typically don't include in any of those studies is how the person or people are feeling, the level of hunger they're experiencing. And he says, I can put someone on a diet that's a low calorie, low carb diet of one kind or another. And I can say, these people lost more weight than these other people on this other diet. But if we don't assess how they're feeling and what level of satisfaction they have, and whether or not they would intend to continue eating this way if left to their own devices once they leave the feeding study or the study period, we aren't really doing anybody any favors if the goal of the science is to help people make changes in their real life down the road under varied circumstances. And again, if we're not talking about how does this affect you if you happen to be in a food insecure environment or in a food desert or swamp, and you're subjected to an endless array of fast food smells while you're trying to stay on this hyper controlled diet. These are real variables that in real life we have to take into consideration, along with like the things you were mentioning, like cultural and concerns and imperatives and preferences, or your level of environmental concern, or anything else. How important is pleasure to you? What health condition are you dealing with? What life stage are you in? What else is going on? None of this is taken into consideration by most of the scientific studies. And so when we read the news headlines, this is my health journalist coming out now, it's really dangerous to rely too much even on the so-called good studies, most of which, it's hard to tell from the headlines if it's a good study or not. The headlines will tell you the conclusion, and you have to go a lot deeper to figure out what was actually in the study. And by the time you figure that out, you may still have a lot of unanswered questions, like what would this mean to a real person in the real world? Which is why I think we come back then to the N of one. As we were just talking about, the study group of one in
Mhm.
real life. Leah, again, holistic health, mind, body, spirit, soul, it's all part of who we are at our essence. Indeed. And it's not part of what most of the information coming our way is designed to help us tune into. So
Mhm.
I think it's a revolutionary act. I think it's a healthy deviant act to elevate the importance of your body's own wisdom and signals. And I think the work that you're doing in this realm, Steph, is really important. And I commend you for having taken your own personal experience and all your own trials and tribulations. There's a lot of ways to do this right. And I think we all are doing our best and doing it perfectly for the place we're in. And what a great thing to open your mind to the fact that you might not have to be, quote unquote, on a diet for the rest of your life. You might
Yeah,
actually get to prioritize your own instincts and your sense of satisfaction and pleasure and learn what works for you.
absolutely. Yeah. I think some of the research that hit me the hardest when I was actually doing a preparation for the presentation I gave in New Zealand, which is like so long ago that we were there.
Oh,
But
Ancestral Health Symposium, New
yeah,
Zealand. I remember it well. It does seem like another world,
our
thanks
Kiwi
to
friends.
Jamie. Yeah, Anastasia.
One of the things that hit me the hardest is, a lot of, and this is kind of a tangential but related topic, which is body image and how we view ourselves and body satisfaction and things of that
Yeah.
nature. Because so often that is the driver for adopting some of these more restrictive ways of eating. And it's no stranger to, or people aren't strangers to the sort of the ideas that the impact to our body image can start when we're very, very young. And studies on young girls or teens or young adults are very, very common, college age women, for example.
Yeah.
But some of the research that I ran into about women in later life, and I'm talking, 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, about how much dissatisfaction they had with their own bodies
Mm,
and the beliefs that they had about themselves, and by extension I can assume their self-worth and their value as people here on this planet,
yeah.
just hit me so hard in the gut that we could get to the end of life and we've had this full life. We've had so much wisdom, there's so many trials and tribulations we've been through, whether it's world events or just personal things. And to know that there is still such an intense focus on looking a certain way or not feeling good enough because you don't look a certain way, it just hurt so much. And I just thought, I can't, like, I have to do something about this in my own small way. And how can I make a difference, or how can I start talking about this more and add to the collective of voices that are talking about this more? And that really, really impacted me in terms of doing this work and opened my eyes.
Oh, I love that. I always like the line from Sean Colvin's song where she says, "May we all be engaged in professions that heal." Because I
Mm,
do think like we've reached a point in our culture where we need more healthy, happy people to solve our world's biggest problems, including a lot of these problems we have created for ourselves in our post-agricultural revolution world. And I think, all of the best opportunities to have a meaningful life slash career slash business, relate to cleaning up the messes that we've created for ourselves over the past several hundred years. And I think it's never too late. If you're a person in your 60s or 70s or 80s, this can still be a really cool and fascinating and freeing experiment to run in your own life. And for those people who, I was thinking I had an older relative who was like, had a colostomy bag, like a terminal cancer. Like this person had a lot of weight like going on in her life. And her concern was still about her figure,
yeah.
was still about that. And I was just like, yikes. So, well, we've covered a lot, and I could talk to you for like 3 more hours. We're going to have to continue our conversation. But I love to encourage people. First of all, I want to let people know about where they can connect with some of the things that you are offering and doing if they want to go deeper. And you actually have a membership program now, too, where you actually take people through a longer term experience, don't you, Steph?
Yeah. So I have my membership where we sort of let the principles of intuitive eating unfold at a more relaxed pace, since normally in the world of nutrition, we want everything to be so fast and quick and done very, 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 very soon. But in the reality of it, it takes a little bit longer. So if
Yeah.
you're a person who likes to learn at a relaxed pace, then we have that option. And that's on the website. I also have a mindful eating tool, which is so great for people who are just getting started. And if what I talked about with mindfulness was really interesting to you, I also teach you how to stack habits in relation to mindful eating so that you can, instead of just saying, that sounds nice, you can actually start doing it every day and get more connected to and more aware of your body, which is so powerful and requires very little actual massive upheaval and change in your life. And most of it is absolutely something you can do for free without any any huge change. So I like that one. And that's on the website as well. And also have some different coaching opportunities and how you can work with me. So you can check that out.
I'm just going to show people your site, which has all of
So
this. Yeah, that fancy lipstick. Whoa.
it's a work in progress.
I love it. I love it. But your podcast is here too. And so people can go deeper by listening in on some of these topics that are related, guest podcasts and so on. And then your programs, ways to work with you down here at the bottom, which is really great.
Yeah.
And we always like to leave people with an experiment that they can run in their own lives, something that we can pull out of this amazing stream of consciousness conversation we've had to say, here's something you could go and try. And I'd love to invite you to offer an experiment, and I'll offer one too.
I love experiments. This is the science teacher in me. So one of the experiments that I love to have people do is to set a timer for 3 random times during the day. It doesn't have to be a meal time, whatever time it. And at that time, just stop whatever you're doing and just kind of do a quick body scan from head to toe and just notice, what do I feel hungry? That's it. And instead of worrying about a number or anything like that, is it pleasant? Is that sensation pleasant? Is it unpleasant? Or is it neutral? Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? And do that 3 times during your day. And just to stop, do a quick body scan, check in. Do you notice any hunger signals in your body? Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? And just see what you discover.
Ooh, I love that. That's great. It makes me think I should have you come and talk to my Healthy Deviant You group, which is my little membership program. But I promised them guest experts with fun experiments, and that sounds like you'd be a great candidate for that. I think that's a good one. In part because I think so often there is pleasure available in the moment if we choose to avail ourselves of it. We just often don't even notice that there's like a nice warm bit of sunshine coming in on us, or it feels good to be petting our dog, or that smell of coffee coming in from the kitchen is just delightful. All this stuff. Okay, I'm going to offer one that's specific to eating that I think is a really interesting. I was inspired by your sharing that so many people are like, doing a whole meal without a distraction, that's a lot. But I have been eating more and more of my meals while doing nothing else. And I am just really loving that. Sitting down and often lighting a candle and really creating a space for my food, not having my phone there, not, doing a bunch of other stuff. So I would strongly encourage people to consider taking, for example, their breakfast meal and really, just make 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be huge. If you get an egg, some greens or a sweet potato or a piece of toast or whatever it is, like eat what you want to eat and really give yourself the gift of tasting it and noticing if it's satisfying you or not. If it has those different flavor categories, like is there a base? Is there a mid? Is there a top note? Put your attention on your food and see how that goes. And if you can't stand that, Dallas knows I'm famous for giving more than one experiment. I love the put the fork down between bites experiment. And I love it for so many reasons I cannot tell you. One is just how habituated we are to forking while we're eating. And that's a form of multitasking too. Like we're planning the next bite before we are really begun to chew the one that's in our mouth. And it does get you to slow down if you put the fork down. It's tremendously difficult at first, but that would be fun to do. Again, if you can't do it for the whole meal, do it for the first 5 minutes and see how it goes. And then if you need more help, look up Steph Gaudreau here at stephgaudreau.com. Am I saying your name right, by the way, Steph? I've always just called you Steph. Is it Gaudreau?
Yeah, so my family is obviously, this is a French-Canadian last name, but we say it in the very American version, which is Gaudreau. But I know, you've done a little French-Canadian sort of Quebec twist on it. I like it.
I studied in France for a few years, so I was probably fairly reflexive at this point. But Gaudreau, Steph Gaudreau.
Yeah.
It's been a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for making time to come on the Living Experiment podcast. And I hope someday when Dallas and I are back in the studio and in the right town, we can have you come and do it with us in person. It would be fun too.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much for having me. You're always a pleasure to talk to, and I'm so glad that I could be here for your audience.
My great pleasure. Happy experimenting, everybody.